Welcome to Cheshire Corners. I'm Sebastian Coco, and I'll be your host as we trip through the looking glass. Today we're introducing the What Is series, which will give a spotlight focus to a specific psychedelic substance every episode. But before we start asking what is LSD and what are shrooms, we really need to ask ourselves what are psychedelics, which is the topic of this week's episode. Before we dive in, if you see something, say something. I try to cite my sources and interpret research well, but if I'm wrong, I want to know. Please let me know in the comments section if we ever present untrue information. The heart of any good research is in communication. Now, back to the question at hand. What are psychedelics? The term psychedelic was coined in 1957 by Humphrey Osmond and comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning soul or mind, and delaun, to manifest. Psychedelic substances are literally mind-manifesting substances. The drugs have had many names to researchers over the years, first being called psychotomimetics as research began on mescaline in the early 20th century. This term is actually intentionally pejorative, as research on psychedelics throughout the 20th century consistently evaluated them as substances that cause psychosis, even though modern research has consistently dismissed this claim. In fact, the most modern and accepted term, psychedelic, that we use here was actually taboo in academic circles up until the turn of the 21st century, just due to the fact that it implies some positive uses for the drugs, with even experts in the field referring to the substances as hallucinogens in relatively contemporary studies. Hallucinogen is also a bit of an insulting misnomer, as the word hallucination was exclusively used in reference to the symptoms of the mentally ill since its invention by a 17th century physician, at least until the term hallucinogen hit the scene in 1954. When referring to psychedelics as hallucinogens, you're saying their main function is to produce vivid hallucinations, similar to the symptoms of psychotic mental disorders, which many modern studies have disproven. In the academic community, the term hallucination is still most widely used in reference to a symptom of psychosis and other related illnesses, just like in this academic review of psychosis, which defines a hallucination as any sensory perception in the absence of a corresponding stimulus. It's probably only in the last 10 years that psychedelic is becoming the standard term, with hallucinogen becoming very popular since just before the turn of the 21st century, and psychotomimetic being the standard before that. The term entheogen is also appropriate to use for a psychedelic substance, literally meaning becoming divine within, and lending the proper religious and spiritual connotations that the drugs have for many. Although the popularity of the term entheogen has been rising among religious anthropologists and recreational users since its inception by Ruck et al. In 1979, the term only had 5 hits in the National Library of Medicine in 2016. Historically, scientists have classified psychedelics in the same category as almost all psychoactive substances, with many researchers lumping LSD and shrooms in with just any dissociative. Back in the days they were all referred to as psychotomimetics. It's only really in the last 10 to 20 years that experts have begun clarifying how to classify psychoactive substances, and these classifications usually depend on which neurotransmitter receptors the drugs affect. Neurotransmitters are vital chemical messengers that move across synapses to allow neurons to communicate in the brain, with specific molecules being associated with specific brain activity. When talking about psychedelics, the main neurotransmitter to consider is serotonin, as the modern, widely accepted definition of a classic psychedelic substance is any molecule that is an agonist or partial agonist of serotonin 5-HT-2A receptors, meaning that classic psychedelic substances cause these receptors to release serotonin into the brain. This includes LSD, DMT, mescaline, and psilocin, the psychedelic chemical synthesized by our bodies after we start to digest the psilocybin in magic mushrooms. It does not include MDMA, ketamine, PCP, and a bevy of other psychoactive drugs that can also have hallucinatory effects, but do not interact with 5-HT-2A receptors as their main method of function. So, why does serotonin, which is generally referred to as 5-HT, and specifically the 5-HT-2A receptor, matter? Well, serotonin has been generally associated with a variety of brain activities, such as coordinating digestion, nausea, and healing, but is most widely studied for its effect on mood, as low levels of serotonin have been associated with mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and schizophrenia. Not to mention that the trip experienced after taking psychedelic drugs is thought to be produced by the brain's perception of a flood of serotonin that is triggered by the activation of 5-HT-2A receptors. Activity stemming from these receptors is very specifically associated with cortical activity and cognition, and the amplification of these are most widely understood by pharmacologists as being responsible for the profoundly altered states of consciousness observed while subjects are affected by psychedelics. All of that is to say, a trip is just a rush of brain chemicals. Essentially, the big question is, how is a relatively standardized dose of serotonin transformed into a completely unique experience? Think about it. When considering most other kinds of drugs, it's much easier to determine how to use them consistently. When a nurse has to reduce pain, she administers a set amount of, let's say, morphine based on a few standard characteristics of the patient and expects the pain to be reduced by a set amount. Relatively speaking, the nurse is very rarely going to be surprised at how much the patient's pain is reduced, because there's a lot more consistency to how we understand the drug's functions. That is not exactly what's been observed for psychedelics, as each unique trip will elicit a unique response from that unique individual. This is not to say that there are no observable rules for specific psychedelics, but more to point at the wide variation in the perception of what a trip is across different people when considering their experience with the same substance. For instance, it's even possible that the same individual taking one tab of acid on two separate occasions, both from the same sheet, will have a wildly different experience from trip to trip. The difference, as I think a lot of people who have tripped before would tell you, is mostly based on what they're thinking about during the trip and how the environment that they trip in affects their thoughts. Because we have only a vacuous understanding of how advanced neuroscientific mechanisms like cognition and emotion actually function on a molecular level, it's really hard to properly measure them as variables beyond what researchers can observe of their subjects' behaviors and testimonies. And because psychedelics can produce incredibly unique behaviors and testimonies from individual to individual, researchers can only very generally state what the dimensions of a trip actually are. One of the consistent behaviors observed in subjects on LSD is portentousness, which Friedman defined as the capacity of the mind to see more than it can tell, to experience more than it can explicate, to believe in and be impressed with more than it can rationally justify, to experience boundlessness and boundaryless events, from the banal to the profound. If a subject's mind can see and experience beyond rational boundaries, how are they supposed to logically explain their experiences under the influences of psychedelics to researchers? And how are researchers supposed to use this information to determine the true cognitive effect of psychedelic substances? Now, let's consider how many wide-ranging points of data are needed to properly represent a psychedelic trip. The two major scales used to quantify psychedelic activity are the hallucinogen rating scale developed in 1994 and the abnormal mental states questionnaire finalized in 1998, which contain 126 and 158 items across 6 and 3 dimensions, respectively. So we're talking about trying to evaluate a substance that produces hundreds of points of existentially driven data in subjects without knowing much about the chemical processes that are actually happening in the brain beyond the activation mechanism and basic pathways. To be honest, we can only barely understand what psychedelics do to the human brain today. Why do we care? First and foremost, because humanity is blessed with supercomputers in our heads, but we really don't know what a lot of parts of our brain actually do and how they work together beyond broad associations. Neuroscience is the actual final frontier, but that's another episode in and of itself. Psychedelics may represent a powerful and insightful tool for the neuroscience of the future. If we can learn more about how they affect complex brain functions like cognition and emotion with fluctuating serotonin levels, it's possible we could apply the same lessons to mental illnesses that have been strongly associated with low serotonin. Studies dating back to the 1960s and 70s showed psychedelics and other dissociatives as promising treatments for debilitating conditions such as alcoholism and PTSD, with new studies in the last 5 to 10 years supporting their findings. And while we're looking to the future, the scientific acceptance of psychedelic therapy has blossomed in the last 5 years, with the first healing centers opening in Oregon and the NIH funding research on psychedelics for the first time since the establishment of the DEA this summer. Behind this, and the recreational industry sure to follow, is a new frontier of commercialization. However, this does come with the controversy of corporatization, as many are fleeing to the psychedelic industry from the cannabis industrial complex as it becomes more bloated and starts to resemble the other stable commercial drug industries like alcohol and tobacco. Hopefully, we can learn from the mistakes of the past when setting up psychedelics for a productive future. And speaking of the past, psychedelics are actually an integral part of human history as well as our future. Entheogenic substances have been used for religious purposes and in ceremony for centuries around the world. From the praise of soma in ancient India, to the continued use of peyote by Native American tribes in the American Southwest, and from writings of psychedelic festivals outside of Athens to accounts of Aztec shamans consuming God's flesh in religious rituals, psychedelics have been used around the world. Don't forget the more modern culture that has stemmed from psychedelic use too. Ever heard of the Grateful Dead? Many of the most prolific artists and musicians in modern history have talked about how their experience with psychedelics affected their work, with a lot of modern pop culture owing everything to some really creative trips. A shocking amount of human culture owes its existence to psychedelics, especially considering how much we've demonized and vilified the substances in more modern and civilized society. When we're talking about psychedelics, we're talking about science, culture, art, religion, the human condition, all in one. There's no one answer to what are psychedelics. The question is just too vague because psychedelics can represent almost anything to anyone. The better question is, what are psychedelics to you? Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And thanks for coming to Cheshire Corners. Don't get psyched out. I did it! Woo!